Last week we talked about hope. We talked about that not being wishes or optimism, but a place in ourselves and in our faith life that allows us to look full on into the catastrophe, the difficulty, the pain, and then to see beyond that to what God may be doing in that circumstance. It's costly. Well, today our gospel has two parables, both of hope. Jesus is trying to describe the kingdom of God, and he uses the image of a seed. A seed is an image that's just potential and full of hope. In the Gospels, we're told that we're participants in this kingdom, and we are called to partner with God and also to just stand back in wonder as we see God's kingdom created before us. What is the kingdom of God? Well, that's probably something we could spend quite a few weeks talking about, but I'm going to give you one definition of the kingdom of God by one Christian, our presiding bishop, Michael Curry. Bishop Curry writes, God has a dream. God has a dream, a vision, a plan, a sublime divine purpose for this world. God has a dream for his creation, a dream for every man, woman, and child who ever walked upon the face of the earth. And God will not rest until our nightmare is ended and God's dream is realized. Jesus came to show us the way to live God's dream instead of our nightmare. And when the world is lived like that, when our lives are lived like that, children don't go to bed hungry. When the world is lived more in accord with God's dream, God's vision for life, then we find ways to lay down our swords and shields down by the riverside and study war no more. When Jesus says the kingdom of God is like, my ears kind of perk up because I want to know about that. So this first image that Jesus gives is of a sower who goes out to sow. I'm out here in the middle of the field at Gobert's farm off of Highway 47, and you can see we've got some pumpkins coming in here. The first thing we hear in the parable is that the sower is very intentional. The sower goes out to plant the seeds, as the Goberts have done here, in beautiful rows, and they're thriving. So the sower does his part or her part in that action. And then in the parable, what does the sower do? Well, sleeps, gets back up again, sleeps again. The sower isn't running sort of obsessively out to the field to see if anything's happening yet, or to fret, or to think, or to act. The sower assumes that seeds are going to do what seeds do, that they'll germinate, and that they'll grow into a crop. Jesus is using this image as the image of the kingdom of God. As natural as it is for seeds to germinate, that's how natural it is for God's kingdom to come to fruition. And you and me, well, we're called to be partners in that. We're called to intentionally go out and sow the seed, and then to surrender the results, knowing it's a natural thing for those seeds to take root. So we show up, right? We show up for our families. We love them. We speak honestly to them. We set a boundary sometimes. Not always easy, but in love. We show up. We show up for our neighbors. We show up at work, online. You know, we're nice to people, even if they're not nice back. We do what's best, even though the fruit might seem a little bit far off. I don't know how God is calling you to show up, but I do know that God's Spirit will reveal that to you, and I do know that you are called to something. So, our first word of hope from the gospel this morning is, it is a natural thing for God's kingdom, for God's commonwealth to come to fruition, and you and I are called to be part of that. Things are a little bit different in the second parable that Jesus tells us in the gospel. Jesus isn't talking about seeds in general anymore. He's talking about a mustard seed specifically. This is Brassica nigra, mustard. Probably not the cultivar Jesus was talking about, but it's one that we're probably more familiar with. and it is an invasive species. If you're ever out in the woods and you see this plant, yank it up. It's the one plant park rangers will thank you for messing with. So pull it up by the roots and give it a toss, because it's an invasive thing and it gets everywhere. So Jesus was comparing the kingdom of God to a weed, and the disciples would have known that. The people he was talking to would have known that. Think about comparing the kingdom of God to crabgrass or creeping Charlie or thistles, for crying out loud. Once those things take hold, you can never get rid of them, can you? They're tenacious, and they get into everything. Weeds do. They climb over stuff, and they crowd out other things, and they pass across all those nice borders that we set up for our gardens, don't they? They're resistant to bugs and disease, and they're just scrappy. From the perspective of a gardener or a lawn aficionado, a weed is a problem. But from the perspective of the survival of the species, it's a pretty good thing. When Jesus compares the kingdom of God to a weed, he's saying that it's in everything, that it grows over all the boundaries that we would set up, that every part of our life is invaded by this kingdom of God, this breaking in of God's kingdom in our lives and in our world. And we can no longer stop that progress of the kingdom of God than we can stop a dandelion from flying into the wind. It's that pervasive. Now, not that Jesus is saying God's kingdom will just progressively get stronger and stronger and stronger, that like 10 years from now, the church will be more influential than it is now. No, he's saying that God's kingdom will come to fruition. And that is such incredible hope. I feel sometimes like I am just being pummeled with discouraging, downcasting, spiraling out of control bad news. You know, everything feels so much bigger and so much more horrible some days. And then I remember the image of this weedy kingdom of God, this scrappy, tenacious image of God's love and of the action of God and God's people in the world. That is a sign of hope. Now I want to show you something. I am here at the Des Plaines River Trail, and our friend the mustard has taken over, because that's what invasive species do. So here in the foreground are mustard plants, but if you look off into the distance, way into the distance, on the ground, it's nothing but mustard. It has taken over all the undergrowth here. This is the kingdom of God. It goes on for acres, these weeds. I hope you'll hold that image of the weeds taking over. When Jesus said the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed, that's one of the things he was speaking to. You and I are called as partners with God. We're called to show up and to do the things that God calls us to do. Even when we don't understand what's happening beneath the ground, when we can't see any change, we're called to show up. And then we get to sit back in wonder and see the power and the pervasiveness of God's love in the world, of God's action in the world, and of the coming of the promised commonwealth of God. Despite what we see around us. Remember last week we talked about recognizing in the present that things are kind of bad, and not belittling that, not denying that, acknowledging that, and then seeing beyond that to what God is doing. I hope the image of the weeds and of the sower will be images that you keep close this week as you are called to faithfulness and as you are called to be part of God's kingdom.
Inch by inch, row by row, someone bless thee. someone warm